It's John Bowden from Rock History Music. You know, when I started this channel, I wanted to talk to the artists that made a difference in my life between the years of 71 when I was 11 to 79 when I was 19 years old, when I left home. I paid a lot of attention when I first got Elton John's Madman Across the Water. I loved symphony, so I paid attention to Paul Buckmaster back then, who'd worked with Elton John as an arranger for quite a long time in his career till we lost him a few years ago. I kind of went from Elton John to Neil Diamond in the early 70s. I love Neil Diamond's earlier hits, and our guest today, Lee Holdridge, has worked with so many of the artists that I love so much. The earlier hits, all the earlier hits from Neil Diamond. Going into 1972, I was 12. I heard Hot August Night from the Greek Theater, that opening which changed my life. It still gives me goosebumps when I listen to it. And everything else he did on Hot August Night. There was Jonathan Livingston Seagull. He moved into John Denver, which I loved. And I followed him throughout his career, doing all his TV work and his movie work. And finally, I had a chance to talk to him. And speaking to Lee Holdridge, and I hope I get a chance to talk to him again, because there's so much more ground to cover. I felt my musical depth widen just by hanging out with the guy for an hour. Our interview with the great Lee Holdridge. What a man. On Rock History Music. He came from the tropics but made his mark in Hollywood. From symphonic suites to silver screen soundtracks, Lee Holdridge was orchestrating deep emotion. Born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 1944, Lee Elwood Holdridge was raised between musical cultures. Earlier on, Holdridge showed promise not just as a musician, but as a composer. He studied violin seriously as a child, but it wasn't until a move to Los Angeles that things started to explode. In the early 1970s, Holdridge broke into Hollywood with quiet determination and quickly found a niche. He began scoring TV movies and miniseries, catching the attention of rising stars and veteran directors alike. A pivotal moment came when he started working with Gordon Lightfoot in 1966 for Lovin' You. The following year, Bitter Green. That was his orchestration on Song for a Winter's Night in 1967, and the same year, the Canadian Railroad Trilogy. There was also the classic Softly by Gordon Lightfoot. Then in '69, he started working with Neil Diamond on the album Touching You, Touching Me. The following year, He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother, that was from Taproot Manuscript. Songs like Song Sung Blue from Moods in 1972, as well as Play Me. One of his greatest early contributions has to be the orchestration on one of the greatest live albums of all time, Neil Diamond's Hot August Night from 1972. That intro to that record stands up as one of the top openings of not only any live album, but any album in the history of music. And then 1973 with Jonathan Livingston Seagull, the soundtrack by Holdridge and Neil Diamond for that classic Richard Bach book. In 1973, Lee Holdridge was doing his magic for John Denver, a relationship that would last for so many years. That was him painting the mood on Farewell Andromeda, Welcome to My Morning. And two from 1974 with Denver, An Evening with John Denver, and Back Home Again, which featured Any Song, the title song, and Sweet Surrender. In '75, Holdridge and Denver created Wind Song with Calypso, Fly Away featuring Olivia Newton-John, and Looking for Space. And let's not forget the latter part of '75 where John Denver and Lee Holdridge released Rocky Mountain Christmas. There were other albums by Anne Murray, Stephen Bishop, and more from John Denver. He worked with Placido Domingo quite a bit in the 80s, as well as Diana Ross, Laura Branigan, Barbra Streisand again, Dionne Warwick, and many others. And let's talk about his soundtrack work and his TV work, including American Pop in '81, The Beastmaster the following year, Mr. Mum, the Michael Keaton comedy in '83, and Splash the following year. His TV work was immense. Highlights included Moonlighting, Beauty and the Beast, and When Calls the Heart. Yet through the accolades, Holdridge remained more interested in the work rather than the spotlight. He scored documentaries, animated features, and even classical concert pieces. For Lee Holdridge, music wasn't about fame. It was about storytelling. I saw an interview with you, and I had a lot of mentors when I was starting to get into radio. It was Jascha Heifetz. Did you ever meet him? Because he died like in '86 in LA.
No, I didn't get a chance to. I wish I had met him, but I didn't get a chance to.
So you heard him play.
Oh, I did. Yeah, I've heard many great violinists play. Oh,
I know
yeah.
someone, I know someone who really influenced you. One of those things where it's like a fork in the road for you. And I know the story. You follow this girl, she's got a violin case, and
Right.
and so is that just a button that clicks? Why did you follow her?
I don't know what happened. It was just completely out of the blue. Uh, I just saw her on the bus and she was carrying the violin, and I suddenly said, I want to learn to play the violin. And everything went from there.
So is he the gentleman? Was it that violin teacher that said you were a composer?
Yes. Ugo Mariani was the conductor in Costa Rica. He was the conductor of the National Symphony Orchestra. And he was a wonderful violinist, and he gave private violin lessons, and that's who I studied with. And then as he knew I was interested in composing, he started inviting me to the rehearsals of the orchestra and stuff like that. And I started to begin to see more and more what was involved. And it just bit me, that's what I wanted to do. That was it. It was end of story.
At what point were you a young man that you knew that you keep sharpening this pencil?
I was about 12 when I really realized that this was what I wanted to do. And I began to realize more and more that there was a lot to learn. There are a lot of people that say, oh, you don't have to study music to be a composer. Oh, yes, you do have to study music to be a composer. It makes a difference. And it makes a difference down the road because you learn all the different disciplines and you learn how to make things work. And you learn why things sound the way they do, and it's helpful when someone says to you, I want this or I want that, you know how to get that for them, especially in the film if they're looking for something. Or, it helped in terms of when I started arranging for people because I had a good sense of counterpoint. I knew what to do with the high violins against the voice, made a big difference.
Well, I interviewed Charlie Callell a little while ago, who did the dun 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 in Neil Diamond's "Sweet
Right,
Caroline," and he
right.
had he had told me that he did that and never heard from Neil again. I'm going, well, I don't know,
Yeah,
people get busy or whatever, but he had told me that when he was working with Engelbert Humperdinck, he was writing the closer for Engelbert. And
right.
Engelbert, for whatever reason, was surprised. He says, "Well, Charlie says, I'm going to write you this thing, and when I get to this part, the audience will rise." And Engelbert says, "Well, what do you mean?" He's, "Well, I'll do something and you understand this." I'm going to do something in the music that will make them rise, and it
Yeah,
always worked every time. And you're doing that with film and practically
yeah,
everything you do. When
yeah.
did that become conscious for
Well,
you?
it's just that music gets to the subconscious of people. I mean, it's just there's no way around it. You know, uh, it's just there. It just creates an ambience. It grabs people. It's just something that you realize it early on that it really affects the way people hear things or look at things, I mean, and you go to concerts and you see how people react to certain pieces. You can't help but notice that, And so I remember, when I started arranging, the thing that was hard is some of these songs were very repetitive. And you kept saying to yourself, well, I got to do something to help the repeats, And that's where you learn the trick of maybe the strings do something a little different each time, And that helps the thing move forward.
How would you explain what you do if you're coming into playing with, well, Neil or John, or is it instinctual? You don't even have to think about that, obviously.
Oh, I could hear things. I hear things in my head. I hear stuff, I mean, I would hear the song and I'd immediately hear a line or I'd hear, so that would be nice to do something against there. I would, I hear it inside my head. And so the trick is to go to a piece of manuscript paper and write it down,
Mhm.
And with John, it was always easy because his songs were always so melodic. It was a little harder with Neil Diamond because there's a lot of repetition. But with John, you fill up my senses. Ba, ba, da, da. You already got a nice lilting melody to work with, and you just go off from there. It's
Yeah,
not
but
very hard.
you built that. I remember noticing that back then. I remember noticing and I remember looking who did
Yeah.
that. Because like it's like Paul Buckmaster and Elton John.
Right.
Immediately I would go, who did that? And people
Yeah,
go, no,
yeah,
never mind that. What about Elton
yeah,
John? Going, yeah, I like the Elton John stuff. There wouldn't be a song without Elton John or Bernie Taupin. But it was
yeah,
like with Annie's song especially.
yeah,
That was the part that sort of made me really pay attention. Then I realized I knew who you were, and then I
yeah.
go back.
That was an example of where the song is really good to begin with, so it's not hard to take off from there, and do some nice touches around it, nice contrapuntal touches. Um, so it's just, it's funny you say Charlie Calello did bum bum bum, and in Song Sung Blue, I'm the one that did bum 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 bum, because there was Song Sung Blue da 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 da
Hey,
da da
wait a minute!
and there's that pause there. And I remember when we did the record, it was like this big long space. And I said, we got to do something there. And I just went over to the piano and went bum, 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 bum. I did the descending thing. And that stayed. It's been in the song ever since.
Well, you can't have the song without it almost now. That's the
No,
thing.
no, no, you can't. But then you hear funny stories. Hal Blaine told me that when he was recording with Herb Alpert at the Tijuana Brass, they were doing a taste of honey. And they were having trouble getting back into this tempo change. So he said, "Look, I'll put 4 beats there." And they say, "Fine, put the 4 beats, and then we'll edit them out for the final recording." They wound up leaving them in. They got so used to the boom, boom. It became part of the record. And he was just said, "I'll give you 4 beats, and then you guys could get back in."
Verts worked with the John, and then all of a sudden the second album comes out and with John and Hal Blaine's there,
Yeah,
and the budget gets bigger, and
yeah, yeah. Well, I introduced Hal Blaine to John. John was kind of saying, I want to work with some of the great LA musicians. And I had worked with all that Wrecking Crew, the famous Wrecking Crew. There was a Wrecking Crew in New York and there was a Wrecking Crew in LA, and they were all fantastic musicians. And they all contributed so much to records. People do not realize the contributions they made to classic pop records. And a guy like Hal Blaine was just one of those. I remember one year we were on tour and Billboard published the 100 most best-selling singles of the last so many years. Hal Blaine had played on 55 of those records. It was amazing to us. It's just like he was like the everyman.
Jim Gordon. I just talked to a guy
Yeah.
who wrote a book on Jim and finally talked to Mike Post, who didn't like talking about Jim a lot because he was one of his
Right.
best.
Right.
Talked to Jim's daughter and talked to Jim's widow after the fact. But
Right.
what was it like for you working with Jim?
He was kind of you could tell he was a moody guy. He was a great drummer, but he was a moody guy. I mean, Hal Blaine was a riot to work for because you had to keep a straight face. Hal Blaine was very subtle. We were working on a movie one time, and the guy wanted he didn't want a shaker, but he wanted something. So Hal took two $10 bills and he was rubbing them together to make the sound. And the producer says, "Well, I'm not quite sure about that sound." And Hal straight face says, "You want me to try two 20s?" Now, the rest of us were on the floor, but Hal was keeping serious, and we knew he was putting this man on because it was kind of crazy. But he was fun to work for. And I was working for a producer one time, and I had Hal Blaine in the studio with me, and the producer said, "I like the arrangement a lot, but I want a different drum feel." And we said, "Well, what kind of are you looking for?" He said, "I'd like more of a Karen Carpenter drum feel." And we all turned and looked at Hal because Hal was Karen Carpenter. And Hal says, "I think I know how to get that for you." And he started playing, and the guy said, "Yeah, that's it. That's it. Nobody said anything.
No
But
one
Hal,
said that's the guy doing it anyway.
anyway, right? But we didn't say that, and Hal had a twinkle in his eye, and it was fine. It was great. We did the session. The guy was happy, and off we went.
Speaking of the orchestral album, you do Nights in White Satin. And
Yeah.
John, when I talked to Justin, I asked him, I said, well, what's the story behind it? And he does, listen, I don't remember. He says, I don't know what story I'm going to give you today. And it's very honest, very refreshing. Why did you cover that song?
Well, at the time, I forget, I was working for a record company, and they picked certain, we just picked songs we liked. That's all it was. It was no big philosophical message. It was just, oh, I like that song. Let's add that. And we picked things that kind of lent themselves to maybe being instrumentals. You know what I'm saying?
I love the story about your mom taking you all to all the movies because as you were telling that story in that other interview, I'm following you around and I can see that.
Yeah.
How big of a part were your parents in how you became and who you became?
Well, they were very supportive. I mean, my father was a scientist, so music wasn't in his orbit, but he understood dedication that he got. And he said, you can be a composer, but you got to work hard at it. You can't just be fluff about it. But my mother was a great influence because she did take me to the movies and I heard all the great scores. And that's a fantastic influence. You don't realize it, but there was all this enormous, rich treasury of music. You were hearing, my era was like hearing movies like Ben-Hur and, some of the early David Lean stuff and, Bridge Over the River Kwai. And you hear these wonderful films and you realize the music is a huge part of it. Makes a huge difference to the film. And so that kind of wakes you up to that reality, and you start realizing the image and the music are very significant together.
You said something that was very simple, but yet profound to me because you don't know what you don't know. I've never thought of it. In movies, you stay there for the trip, but on TV, when you're composed, you remember that they're leaving the room, they're going all over the place.
Yeah.
You know what? I think Joe Lunchbucket and Evelyn, everybody know that, but they don't know that.
Yeah. Well, Glenn Larson, who was a very famous, successful television producer of the 70s and 80s, he had a ton of shows on TV. I remember once he said, I want the cue to start here. I said, what's the reason for the cue starting here? He said, it tells the audience when to look up. I never forgot that. I was like stunned that he said that, but he said it. It tells everybody something's happening. You better pay attention.
Yeah, yeah. What was how did the Neil Diamond thing happen? What was the
Well, I was doing some arranging for some producers at RCA Records in New York during the late 60s. And one of the producers was a big Neil Diamond fan, and he kept using Neil Diamond songs for his different singers. And I arranged a couple of them, and unbeknownst to me, that he loved the arrangements that I did, but unbeknownst to me, Tom Catalano was a good friend of his. And he played one of the records for Tom Catalano, and Tom Catalano played it for Neil Diamond. And they really loved it. I forget what the record was, but not long after that, I got a call from Tom Catalano. He said, Neil would love to have you come do some arrangements for him. He's going to go to LA for the first time. So that's when they invited me to come out. It was 1969. Can you believe it? And the first song I worked on was a song called Holly Holy. And I heard the track and I said, oh my gosh, it's just one long E major repetition. So what are we going to do with this? But you notice it's a very subtle thing, but the strings keep making little variations as the record goes. And it seemed to help it. And that got me the gig, so to speak. They were very impressed. They loved it. So I did a lot of stuff with him after that.
Mom, I don't know if you remember me playing this. I played her Hot August Night. She didn't cry. I mean, I play it once a week. I don't know what it was in that moment playing it for my mother. I started crying again. I remember the first reaction I had to when you really kick in and Dennis St. John comes in with boom, boom, may he rest in peace wherever he is. I love Dennis St. John. I mean, as a drummer, big man, big drums.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Very much so. But that opening was very unusual for Hot August Night. That really got everybody's attention. And I don't know, they didn't they said, can we start small with strings and build? And I said, okay. And I just wrote that thing. I sat down and wrote it and we played it and they said that's perfect. And it led into that,
Country
tremolo
granola.
waltz out thing, and then the drums, everything comes crashing in like that. And then Neil Diamond comes through the smoke onto the stage. I tell you something, John, I in my mind, that's when Neil Diamond became a mega star. When he stepped on that stage in Hot August Night, the formulas after that changed. And I was there to witness it. You see it happen. It's like the universe has a chemistry and say, okay, the minute he went through that smoke and came out on that stage, it was a different world after that. Same thing with Placido Domingo. The minute he did that duet with John Denver, it was a different world after that. He was well known as an opera singer and respected as an opera singer, but that duet changed everything. Changed everything. All of a sudden, he was like a star. I mean, people would go to the opera that had never been to the opera before just to see him.
Must have performed at the Greek before Hot August Night, or had you?
No, I hadn't. That was my first time.
What's the whole thing? Was it Jonathan Livingston Seagull where Neil didn't want to give you
It
credit?
was Jonathan Livingston Seagull. That was after Hot August Night.
Yeah.
In a strange way, we became a little full of ourselves after that, if you know what I'm saying. And 1973, he says, I'm doing this film score. Jonathan Livingston Seagull said, okay, great. He said, I want you to do the arrangements. Okay, great. So I'm sitting waiting to be handed music to write these arrangements, and nothing shows up. And the producers are saying, well, we got to score the film. We got to score the film. So I started taking little pieces of the songs, like 8 bars here, and making big, long pieces out of it. And when you make a 5-minute work out of 8 bars, you got to add a lot of original material to it because you can't keep repeating those 8 bars over and over and over again. You got to do something with it. You got to develop it. You got to add another counter theme. You got to bring new themes in. I did all of that stuff. That whole sequence where Jonathan Livingston Seagull flies off and, he makes the journey. It's like a 5-minute cue. And I was doing all this work and I started to say, hey, any chance I could get some credit here, for what I've done? And it was always met with like a silence. And the bottom line is, I felt that they sort of took that away from me. I didn't want credit for the songs. I said, Neil, they're your songs. Okay, fine. But why don't you say the score was written by the two of us, even though I did 95% of the work? But I said, let's just call it the two of us. End of story. Music score by, it would have been very simple. And he kind of shot himself in the foot because he wouldn't do that. The Academy he wouldn't recognize me. The Academy didn't accept the score for submission. And that score could have been a shoe-in, John. That would have been, and they had a category at that time for what they called the background score in a musical. If you had songs, you could submit the songs, but you could also submit the background score. We would have walked away with that thing, but he wouldn't do it. He absolutely did not want to share credit.
And never
And
did?
he never did. I have a credit on the film says that I did all the arrangements, but I actually wrote a lot of that music. But so it wasn't fair. But I grew up after that because then I realized, some of my friends said, you better get an agent, get someone who'll fight for you, because I didn't understand that that's what I thought people were honorable and would honor their agreements, but it didn't happen that way.
Is that part of the way you were raised? Is that your parents instilled that on you?
Well, I never was. I didn't grow up thinking that there were a lot of evil people out there. You know what I mean? it was not a question of evil. It was just a question of like fair is fair. That's all.
Mhm.
Neil, we're not asking for something beyond what I'm asking for. I thought what my request was very fair,
Yeah.
but he didn't understand that. Years later, we sort of, they did a documentary at the BBC, and I agreed to be interviewed for it, and I said only good things about him. I did not bring up all this stuff. And I said some very nice things about him, and he actually wrote me a note and said, "Thank you very much." So, you know, you can't live your life, angry. It just doesn't work. I felt badly at the time because it could have been a huge career boost for me if I'd gotten the joint credit. But Hollywood is a big gossip town. Everybody knew what I did in that film. All the musicians were, we had 80-piece orchestras. They knew what was going on. They knew that I was writing most of it. So they all start yakking to everybody. So I got a call from a producer once saying, "I want a score just like you wrote for Jonathan Livingston Seagull." I said, "Well, you mean Neil Diamond?" He said, "No, come on, I know you wrote that score." I mean, some total stranger says that to me. So, there you go. And I never, there was no bad thing about the songs. The songs were great. Neil, you wrote some great songs, but the score is something else. One of my proudest moments with Neil Diamond was they wanted him to do some cover songs, other people's songs. And I really liked his voice. I felt he had a kind of really nice, moody baritone. And I convinced him to do Randy Newman's I Think It's Going to Rain Today. And he agreed to come into the studio and let me do it live with him. He never really recorded live, but that song, if you listen to it, we did it live. He's in the studio singing while we're doing the track. And I love that because I think there's a vibrancy about it. And he's wonderful doing that song. And I'm one of the few people that understood Randy Newman's harmonies because they're very 20th century, Samuel Barber, Aaron Copland type harmonies, and I knew immediately what he was doing, so I knew how to voice him properly because I had heard other versions of that song and they kind of generally messed up on the harmonies. And that song, if you do the harmonies exactly the way Randy Newman played it on the piano, it works gangbusters.
How did it end with you and Neil? When were you just getting busy? Like,
Well, after the Jonathan Livingston Seagull situation, we couldn't really work together. So we kind of parted ways, and the film did help launch my career. I mean, after that, I started getting a lot of calls to do stuff. So, things went on their own from there. But that's fine, whatever. We live and we learn.
a while ago, I talked to Terry Brown. He did all the Rush, the rock band Rush. I said, "Who did you want to work with?" And it was an interesting. I asked Bill Simzik of the Eagles the same thing. I'm saying that for a reason. So Terry Brown, the Rush producers, I wish I would have worked with the Eagles. And we're, what? He said, "No, no, no. See, just because I was successful with a band doesn't mean that's all I am." And
Right.
Bill Simzik, I forget what Bill Simzik told me. It was something very obscure as well. Are there people when you that through the years, maybe not now as much, that you wanted to work with, but through you'd like to work with?
Well, I worked with a lot of singers, as you know. Neil, Barbara Streisand. By the way, there's a quote of mine. I worked for Neil Diamond, I worked for Barbara Streisand, and I worked for Jane Oliver. And they all went to the same high school in Brooklyn, and they were all hard to work for, temperamental, and each one in their own way. And somebody said that I turned around one day and said, "What is it about singers from Brooklyn?"
I talked to Bill Shanae about working with Barbara Streisand. He
Oh
just
my
said
gosh.
she knew what she wanted, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, she was terrific to work for. And there's a song called Wet on one of her CDs. That was also done live. She's in the studio with me with the orchestra and she sings it live. Again, it's very visceral because she's standing right there as I'm conducting the orchestra. Yeah, I love that kind of recording, but you rarely got that in pop music because everything was overdubbed.
Yeah.
But every now and then you could capture that magic of the artist in their true live element. She could do that. She was able to do that. Domingo was able to do that. Diamond did it for me on that Randy Newman song, but he didn't want to do it too often. But I told him he was very good at that. John Denver, of course, we did so many live concerts together. John was a John was very consistent. He could really, I mean, you could tell him, John, you got to play that chord that way. He would do it every time, every time. He was very consistent. I tell people Annie's song, when he first played me Annie's song on the 12th string, he played all those descending lines and everything that are in the song. I said, he played them. They were there. They were in the song. I said, he was quite a guitarist. I said, the 12th string is a bear to play, to begin with, and to tune, never mind that, but he would play it all the time. John worked hard. People don't realize it, but he worked hard at things. He really did work hard at things. He had a lot of personal problems, but he didn't bring him to the studio. He did not, when he walked into the studio, he was there to make music. That's all he cared about.
But to you, John Denver was?
Milt Oken introduced me to him early in the early 70s. We did an album together for Mary, Peter, Paul, and Mary. She did a couple of solo albums, and I did the arrangements. And John wrote a couple of tracks for her, and he came in and played guitar on the tracks. And I met him that way, and we sort of started chatting with each other. And then when John started saying to Milt, I would like some strings on my songs. We need to produce them a little more. Milt said, let's bring in Lee. And we went from there,
What do you think it was with the glue with you two?
Well, John was very down to earth. He was a very down to earth person. Anybody could talk to him. You could walk up to him and start chatting with him. He didn't have a lot of, he didn't have the ego, you know what I'm saying? He was very, very approachable. And that was the beauty of him. He was truly a very, very transparent kind of person. And so we all had fun with him. We loved working with him. We were very loyal to him because he was a terrific guy, and we kidded him, we made fun of him, we did stuff with him, but we always made sure the music was first class,
Was he able to laugh at himself? That's a quality that I see.
Oh yeah, he did. He did all the time. He did all the time. And what he learned. I mean, when we did the duet with Placido Domingo, he was fascinated by the way opera singers would stress certain words in the lyric. Perhaps love is like an ocean. He said, look, I like the way he kind of brings certain words forward. John started doing that after that. He started singing with the idea, bring out the lyrics more.
Is that phrasing?
It's not just phrasing, it's the emphasis on the word. Domingo, if you listen to Domingo carefully, and most opera singers do that. They go for the word. The word has the most meaning in the sentence is the one they bring out. And it's John picked up on it immediately. So he listened to stuff,
By the way, Calypso, what you did on Calypso,
Oh.
You're making me cry again.
Well, John really turned me loose. He said, Lee, just go for it. Just go to town. So I did.
That again just came out of your head, or did you work?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, the song has that inherent quality in it, but I kept hearing these different layers coming in, and John kept encouraging it.
You're flying with the angels on that.
Well, then there's songs that, like, for instance, The Higher We Fly. There was that poem. John loved that poem. I said, Lee, I'd love to do a song with this, but I don't know what to do with it. Would you take a crack at it? So I wrote that song, the music. He and Joe Henry had put that chorus together, the lyrics, and I came in and played him the song, and he said, that's great, let's do it. And he recorded it. So The Higher We Fly is my music. and the lyric, the poem, and then he and Joe Henry added that little chorus lyric. There were several other things like that we did, where he turned to me, and he was very gracious. A couple of times I helped him fix the song or two, and he would give me co-writing credit on it.
You're in an office. Some guy looks at you, doesn't recognize you, but he looks at you and he says, "So what do you do? Do you go there? Because your story's not 30 seconds."
I mean, people ask me, I just say I'm a composer. That's what I say.
Yeah, but the next question is, would you have done anything I know? That's obviously the next question.
Well, I say, well, I've done a couple of well-known films like Splash and, Mr. Mom and a few big comedy hits of the 80s and 90s. And I did some TV shows. Moonlighting is my song. I wrote the music to that. Al Jarreau wrote the lyric. And we actually had a top 20 record with that. And so in the television Beauty and the Beast, the music was very successful for that, and gave Disney the idea to do Beauty and the Beast. But we were first.
Mr. Karen didn't think somehow you could get him, right?
He didn't. He didn't. He brought me in early on the series, and I read the script, and he said, "Write 5 themes, what you think should go with the script." So I wrote 5 themes. And he gave me a budget. I went in the studio and recorded them. I brought him the tape. He said, "Yeah, I really liked them, but I especially liked number 3, which was the instrumental of that song." And he was thinking. He said, "Well, I'd love to turn it into a song." And he said, "Maybe I can find someone to write a lyric." I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "Who's your favorite singer?" And he said, "Al Jarreau." He said, "This show is Al Jarreau. It's like." I said, "Well, let me see if I can get Al to write the lyric and sing it." He said, "Oh, that'll never happen." I said, "You got to be patient. Give me some time." It took me 3 months, but I got it done, because Al was, "Oh, I'm going to Brazil. I don't have time right now. I got a tour in Brazil. Oh, no, I got to go to Japan."
He was a little flighty.
Yeah, Al, listen to the song. Listen to the music. Write a lyric. I kept on it. He finally did. A week before the show was supposed to air, we recorded the track for the song. We went into a studio. I brought 5 great rhythm players. I brought Al. We cut the track. That's what went into the show.
Wasn't it released as an instrumental as well?
Well, I think we eventually put a sax player on it or something. But that track, and the producer was having heart attacks. He said, "Lee, the show airs in a week." I said, "It's the record business. It marches to a different drummer." Somehow I got Al into the studio. I got a great rhythm section. We did the track. It all happened like right then and there. Al did his vocal. The rest is history, And then what happened was the show became a big hit. So I went to Warner Brothers and said, "Let's do a single." And Warner Brothers, you know what the executives at Warner Brothers said? They said, "We don't do television." But then Niles Rodgers came to the rescue, and because he was producing Al, and he said, "Hey, yeah, he made the record, the commercial version of it." But he listened to I sent him the charts that I use, and he used those.
You did When Calls the Heart, right? With Aaron Krakow?
I was the beginning composer on that. Yeah, I did the first season or something like that. And then they took it to Canada. And the Canadian government said, "Oh, no, you have to hire Canadian composers." They have the content laws, which means if they're doing a series, if you're filming a series in Canada, you have to use Canadian talent, except for the actors, the headline actors. But you have to use all Canadian talent. England does the same thing. Australia does the same thing. All these places do that. We're the only country that says, "Oh no, come on in, make your movies, whatever." The story that happened when John Denver died, his manager threw out all the arrangements. He thought they were taking space, and he didn't want to pay the $300 a month storage fee. But fortunately, I had kept the original, I had kept pencil copies of everything. So both Jim Curry and the guy in Canada Rick Worrell, we restored all those arrangements. We put them on computer, we brought them all back to life. So they performed these arrangements, but I had nothing to do with the Orpheum in Canada. That's his estate trying to do that, but they don't use the original arrangements, which I think is ludicrous. Here you have John Denver. He's like a signature musician. His arrangements are very specific, and they go off and do other arrangements. And I say, why aren't you using the original stuff that he was involved in?
Yeah.
I said he had a big hand in those arrangements. I was there with him when we did everything.
Is there anything you can share about that working on that film?
Well, you know, it wasn't. I worked on those two comedies literally back to back, Splash and Mr. Mom. You know, both of them are like iconic films from the 80s. And Mr. Mom was really fun, but it was there was something that wasn't working. They took it out on a preview and it was bombed. And they didn't know what to do. The producers were like scratching their head. And they brought it back to MGM and they got an old time film editor that had edited a lot of the great comedies of the 30s and 40s. And they gave it to him. He recut the entire film and made it the film that it is today. He changed the tempo of it, the whole thing. I had to do a lot of rescoring because now the timings were all different. But I thought the film was a gem. I thought Splash was a gem. I thought Mr. Mom was a gem. And I've been proven right because those films are like timeless. Mr. Mom, you can watch it today. It still applies today.
Yeah, no kidding, eh?
You know, and that was John Hughes, you know, the famous director. That was his first script. And I mean, some of the dialogue in that, you know, that movie is like, you know, when they ask Michael, when they says that, he says, I'm rewiring the entire house. And he says, 220. He says, oh, 220, 240, whatever it takes. He didn't know what he was talking about. But
Yeah.
and Michael Keaton was marvelous because he didn't overplay it. It was very funny, but he was very natural, if you know what I'm saying. It was a beautiful performance. You know, look, he's become a fantastic actor, hasn't he? You know, oh, it was a lot of fun to work with. You know, Jim Abrams was a legendary comedy director. He was a lot of fun to work for. And we just had a good time, you know. It was a crazy idea for a movie, but it was terrific fun. Uh, I was very lucky. I've been very lucky. I've worked with some wonderful people, and it's been always a nice adventure. No two are the same, you know what I mean?
Are you still working or are you retired?
Yeah, I'm working. I've got a wonderful film that's out right now that just came out called Brothers After War. It's a documentary. It's a marvelous film. I did a film almost 10 years ago called Brothers at War. The filmmaker followed his two brothers to Afghanistan and Iraq and filmed them, went into combat with them, literally. And he came back and he said, you know, he met a lot of wonderful guys there and girls. And he said he wanted to make a film about them 15 years later. How are they doing now? And that's this film, Brothers After War. It's 15 years later. And you know, it's a difficult time for a lot of those men and women. And this film is very, very, very powerful and very heart-wrenching. And it's hopeful too. It's a hopeful film. So it's a marvelous film. I loved working on it. There's some wonderful music in it.
Years ago, I was talking to Bruce Hornsby, and he told me something that, again, unless you're in that world, you don't think about, but people know it. He says, you know, you get in the right sport, you don't get injured, you're going to be rich. He says, music's not like that. And I knew a few in the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. My friend Michelle, she was, I think, a second string oboist, I think, in the orchestra. And whenever she'd get a gig, she'd go like, oh my God, I got a gig. This is so great. I'm going, oh my God, you're one of the best musicians I've ever met in my life. When you were hiring your people, did you have your people? Did you have like your gang?
Yeah, I had certain musicians that I really wanted badly. I knew they were phenomenal soloists and I could write beautiful solos for them. And so you want those people, but I relied on contractors sometimes. Well, so-and-so is not available. I said, okay, get me someone terrific. and they would get you someone terrific, you know. So the talent pool that was here and in New York was amazing. You know, there was you could you could have three symphony orchestras in LA going at the same time, and they were all good. They were all terrific. So I always felt that we had the best. We had the best here. We've always had the best. And so, in that sense, yeah, you might have had people in mind, but if you couldn't get them, you had to be, you know, there were schedules. You didn't have you couldn't say to the producer, "Oh, can we do this a week later?" No, they didn't want to hear about that. They wanted it done when they wanted it done. But I was very fortunate, and I worked a lot in Europe. I've done a lot of scores in Europe. I've recorded in Europe, and there's some fantastic orchestras there and fantastic musicians there. So. And in Canada too. I did a number of films with the Toronto Symphony. We went to Toronto to record, and terrific orchestra, terrific musicians. So I can't complain. Been very fortunate. I've gotten to work with some excellent, excellent musicians. The thing that's happened now, John, is that streaming does not pay the royalties that we used to get from television and stuff. It's dropped considerably. I don't know if you talk to other composers and people like that, but it's a bit of a shock to the system
Yeah.
when you get your statement now and it's not even near what it used to be, you know. So it's a new reality. We're all living in a new reality now.
What was it about Tom, do you think? What was he like to work with?
He was fantastic. He's fantastic. He was he listened carefully. He didn't say a lot, but he had a few little things that he would do. He kind of knew. I mean, he edited Cracklin' Rosie. That song wasn't the way it was, the way everybody knows it. He pieced it back together again and put the right pieces together. Tom was a very subtle. I loved working for him, and he loved music. He was a to him he told me once that the studio was like a temple to him. You know, when I enter there, it's sacred. You know, and he really cared a lot about the music. Um, you know, I mentioned Jane Oliver. I worked with her. I found her in New York. She was brought to me, and I tried to sign her to all these labels and everything.
You discovered Jane? You kind of like,
Well, I was one of the first ones to actually try to hire her, you know, and she was the record companies didn't see it in her, but then she started doing little clubs in the Greenwich Village, and all of a sudden she got everybody's attention, and she did her first album. It was okay, but CBS wanted her to do another album, and I said to her, "You got to work with a famous record producer." They wanted to put her together. They said, "Who do you suggest?" I said, "Tom Catalano."
yeah,
So they produced an album called Chasing Rainbows, which you know was in the top. It sold like 500,000 albums at the time, which was fantastic. And it's a beautifully produced album. It was an example of Tom Catalano very carefully going, you know, he was one of the few producers I knew that would listen to maybe 100, 200, 300 songs that people would submit before he picked the ones he wanted. And that album made Robert Hilburn, the music critic at the time, he made his top 10 list. It was very successful. She was supposed to do another album with him. And she said to me, "I don't want to work with him anymore. He's too controlling." I said, "Jane, this is college. This is university. You're learning. He's one of the masters.
yeah.
Work with him. He'll teach you everything you need to know. Then you can go off and do whatever you want." But I said, take this time with him because he showed her how to sing in the mic. He's so many things. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to do it. And I kept saying, "Jane, you'll probably have a hit with him. If you just stick it out, you'll have a hit. Just hang in there." She wouldn't listen to me. She went off and did her third album by herself, and it was a disaster. And I just, you know, I mean, I know he was a stickler and he seemed very disciplined, but I think he was good for her. And if you listen to Chasing Rainbows, that's the best work she did. Well, I thought she could have had a fantastic career, but she kind of, I don't know. John, I tell you, ego is a big danger. Early violin teacher that I met in Costa Rica, he had a saying. He said to me, he told me in Spanish, of course, but he said, don't get air of the mountain. Aire de la montaña. I said, what is air of the mountain? He said, that's the feeling that you're better than you really are. You know, you think you're better than you are. He said, you always have to be a student, always a student. He stressed that. And never forgotten that. I said, you know what? You're always learning. You can always learn. But, you know, I would see some of these pop people think that they knew it all.
Mhm.
And that's how dangerous. You can't get that way.
Jeff Skunk Baxter told me something. He says, you know what? Again, something that's obvious. He says, you go there to serve, you go in the studio, you serve the song, man. You serve the song,
Yeah.
you serve the artist, but you serve the song.
Right, exactly. I believe that too. I agree with him. That's really what you're there for. You're there for the music, you're there for the song. You try to help the artist, you know, as much as you can. And that's what you do. That's your duty. You know, it has nothing to do with anything. You doesn't matter what you think of them. It doesn't matter. It's all about the music and the song.
Overall, what musicians really impressed you, whether they're named musicians or not?
Well, that's hard to answer because it's like what I told you earlier. I worked with so many fantastic musicians and great artists. You know, Glenn Dictorow, violinist, played my violin concerto. I was in awe of his playing. Now, I started out as a violinist, but I was in awe of his playing. I thought he was superb. He played my concerto beautifully. That's that wonderful recording that we did with the London Symphony Orchestra. And his playing on that is absolutely miraculous. Um, there's been a lot of musicians that have affected me. I mean, I, you know, I like to think that sometimes I'm composing something and I think I'm pretty good, and then I have to go to the market. So I go get in the car and I put on a classical radio and I hear a piece come on. I said, oh, that's how you're supposed to compose.
Still a student.
Oh, absolutely. You know, and then I love that quote. I saw it somewhere. I don't know where I heard it, but somebody said, well, there's Bach and then there's the rest of us.
Uh,
And I say, I feel that way sometimes. You know, I feel like these iconic great composers are like Mount Everest to me. I said, oh gosh, if I could only be up there for a second, you know, and have a little taste of what they do, you know, but it's just that's it. You're just a student. You got to be a student. You got to be listening. You got to be saying to yourself, well, maybe I could do that better. Maybe I could do that better. And I feel that I have some really good pieces of music and I have some really wonderful songs and some great scores. But not everything I did was fantastic. There were some things I said, well, I could have done that differently. I could have done it different. Sometimes it's circumstances. Sometimes you're working for someone who's impossible and they want to change everything you wrote. So that's a very difficult situation, you know.
I love
Oh,
Beauty and the Beast. I just
well,
love
that
that.
that to me is a very special series. You know, that whole series, the way we did the orchestras in that, and the way the music had a role in that, it was wonderful. And I think that series is, you know, has a big cult following, as you well know.
Yeah.
But I think they're wonderful films. And you know, the guy that was a collaborator on that, the two writers that Ron Coslow and George R. Martin. Does the last name ring a bell? They knew how to write. I'm a big admirer of script writing. I think script writing is a field that people need to pay more attention to the script because that's what really makes the film. It really makes it. What people say, what the story is, that's the ball game right there.
There's that part of purpose. My father turned 65 and he sat in his chair and he was lucky he lived till 87, but
Yeah.
he didn't move. He wasn't, this is so much,
No,
right?
no,
I
no,
mean,
no.
what about you? How do you look at this? Do you still
Well, my father, being a scientist, instilled that in me. He said, you got to keep the mind going. He said, never stop growing, never stop thinking, always pursuing. My father was constantly trying to learn. He learned physics in his 70s, you know, you studied physics. I mean, you just have to, you can't slow down. I'm always composing. I'm working on films. I'm working on classical pieces. I'm always thinking about what I can do. And you have to push at those envelopes. You have to keep the mind active and alive. This sitting down and retiring, I don't even want to hear those words. I don't want to hear about that. I don't consider that's not an option, you know. I have a friend that says, I want to keep writing, and then one day they'll come and take the pencil out of my hand and put me in the tube. So that's an image to think about.
And thank you for the chat. I really appreciate it. You know
Okay,
what?
well, we had fun. This was a lot of fun, John.
Take good
Great.
care of yourself, okay?
All right, you too. All right, John.
All right.
Anytime. If you want to do it again sometime, let me know.
Okay, we'll do. One of my favorite interviews in 41 years. As I mentioned, I hope I get a chance to talk to him again because there's so much things we didn't talk about from his vast career. And what a nice guy, too. Remember, if you want to support the channel, you can make a PayPal donation. The link is at the very top. Everything's in the description. You can join our Patreon. You get early access to all our videos. Also buy a t-shirt or a cap or a coat from our swag store. But subscribe to our channel, click the bell notification. Make sure you comment on our videos, share them on social media, and like them as well. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Music. Take good care of yourself.